My name is Brian Rhodes. I'm a director of Connected Car and Vehicle Experience Research at S&P Global. I'm here with an esteemed panel of industry experts. Really excited about this one. I'll introduce you, I guess, in order of where we're sitting. So Jim Adler is the founder and general partner of Toyota Ventures. Austin Russel is the founder and CEO of Luminar Technologies. Aicha Evans is the CEO of Zoox. And Darran Anderson is the Director of Strategy and Innovation with the Texas Department of Transportation. Appreciate you all being here today. Round of applause for our panelists here. So yeah, I'll keep this brief because I really want to jump right into it. But this panel, as you see in your guide here, it's all about the intersection of safety and technology in the dawn of an entirely new automotive industry. The convergence of technologies related to connectivity, convenience, infotainment, and safety requires changes to manufacturing, distribution, sourcing strategy, capital allocation. As this industry faces more headwinds than I have time to recite right now, and as mid and long-term policy is as uncertain as ever, what better time to be having this discussion around some interesting technologies. So without further ado, let's get right into it, and I'll join you so it's not so formal here. So I want to start with a regulatory outlook. I think really timely here that we have an update to US NCAP just a couple of weeks ago. We saw this revision including a number of new features like automatic emergency braking, blind spot warning, lane keep assist, et cetera, as well as an update to the roadmap that would see, I think very interestingly, these features influence ratings down the road, safety ratings. So Austin, maybe kick it off with you. First of all, what do you make of the update? What's interesting there? And then, I think in some aspects this brings a little bit more harmony with Euro NCAP. But broadly speaking, what do you see in terms of opportunities or challenges with non-harmonized regulation?
Yeah, it's interesting, and there's ultimately differences between different kinds of regulation when it comes to broader driverless vehicles, versus say enhancing safety features on existing production cars. And I think this is where, as you mentioned, despite all the headwinds that have happened that everyone's aware of when it comes to EVs and other kinds of platforms that have taken a little bit longer to launch for some of these global companies, I think this is one of the most interesting areas of huge tailwind when it comes to advancing automotive technology and safety on vehicles more broadly. And as we all know, there's on the order of 1.5 million lives lost every year globally due to vehicle accidents. And really, for the first time, something being stepped up to see a huge, NHTSA mandate being put into place to be able to say, hey, it's no longer okay to be able to allow cars to be able to make contact and hit pedestrians, without interventions to be able to prevent this from happening with new technologies. And at the same time, seeing things like the US NCAP be updated in a material capacity for the first time on the order of a decade, just recently now here, which is amazing with some of these new enhanced rules is fantastic. And I think this is a huge step forward. There's still continued room to be able to grow, I think, when it comes in and even taking it further, for example, rather than just, keeping it in a vacuum, being able to put it, the test results on the Monroney label on the actual car itself, to be able for consumers to have awareness of those kinds of features and, in a published capacity. So really interesting to be able to see, and I think this is going to be one of the defining moments more broadly as the NHTSA mandate moves full speed ahead to be able to define what the future of automotive safety and ties in directly with the rest of the ADAS and autonomous vehicle stack, because it's the same fundamental technology that gets to enable both. And in this case, obviously it's a little bit self-serving, for us with Luminar when it comes to implementing LiDAR on more vehicles more broadly, and why we start to see some of the automakers standardizing the technology. But 2029 seems like a long ways away, but in automotive years, it's, as we all know, it's right around the corner. So we're all ramping up.
Yeah, and Jim, turning this over to you, we see new requirements or guidelines leading to either new technology or more likely a democratization of existing technology through vehicle lineups. How does investment fit into the consideration of how widespread a feature might need to be deployed down the line?
Yeah, so new requirements certainly drive new technologies, but I think that's only in more mature industries. I think new technologies actually drive the need for new requirements. It's kind of flipped. And so what's happening in automotive is the market is moving faster and faster because of the Chinese, big tech, Tesla, software-defined vehicle. That is pushing a lot of the innovation much faster than previously. And so the way we look at it is, first of all, is this technology actually delivering real value to real customers in a defensible way? The second that we look at is this market big enough and broken enough and willing to take disruption? I mean, some markets are huge, but completely uninvestable or traditionally uninvestable. Government is typically one, although certain areas of the defense industry are more accessible. Automotive, up to 15 years ago, was not accessible to disruptive technology. Only with the advent of maps and mobile internet did automotive kind of get cracked open to innovation. And then you go a little bit deeper, and what are the tailwinds and headwinds, like the tailwinds that Austin was talking about? The wisdom is knowing which is a tailwind and which is a headwind. Seems easy. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was this piece of legislation you all might be familiar with called the Inflation Reduction Act. And we thought, many thought that, oh, okay, EVs will be 50% market share in 10 years. And we thought that's a huge, some people thought it was a huge tailwind. Some folks on our investment team thought it was a huge tailwind. And we started to do some math like, okay, how much power would that draw from the grid? What kind of battery production would be required to deliver at a price point that would be competitive with hybrids and internal combustion engines? And it turned out that that headwind was an order of magnitude bigger than any government tailwind. So you kind of got to go to that second layer and kind of think about, is this really globally helpful or not? And if not, is it locally true? And we think it may be locally true in like urban environments. For example, we have an investment, I'll be self-serving and talk my book too. We have an investment in Revel up in New York City, soon in San Francisco and LA, that is doing just urban EV charging with public infrastructure and a taxi service on top that effectively pays for the electric infrastructure, which I think is kind of genius in many ways. And we think that could be incredibly profitable in those urban environments. Outside the urban environments, we don't think there's no tailwind there at all.
Interesting. Aicha, a big part of the story around fully autonomous vehicles, of course, is regulatory. And a big story around the country the last month has been regulatory. I'm really curious in terms of how you set a North Star to plan against with changing winds, whether it's actual policy to come or it's just vibes that policy may change.
I mean, first, we accept and embrace reality. I don't want to live in a country where I'm allowed to deploy a fully autonomous robot roaming around cities amongst human drivers without some regulatory framework. I'm not interested in that. And so our North Star is simple. Engage on a regular basis. Second thing is full transparency. No matter what, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, full transparency. Third is no surprises. We never do anything without first talking to state, local, meaning cities, state, and the federal authorities across the board. So that's sort of our North Star. Along the way, there are a lot of conversation. Look, this innovation's coming. There is no stopping it. The genie is not going back into the bottle. And there are others around the world that are trying to do this, and they tend to move much faster, actually, than we do, even though I think we move pretty fast. We have an awesome opportunity, and it's a matter of hopefully getting a path that is a little bit more harmonious for everybody. But we're excited. I mean, we're out there. I'm also going to be self-serving. It's been, a couple of weeks or so of having I normally say her, but I'm going to say the robo-taxi. Driving around south of Market in San Francisco and also on the Las Vegas Strip. And you can just see other people see it and they get it. The future is here. And it's just a matter of working with the authorities together to figure that out along the way.
Yeah, you raise a great point in terms of managing local regulations. It's relationships at federal, at state, at municipality level. And Darran, I think this is a great opportunity to bring you into the conversation. In terms of influencing, enabling innovation, what would you say the Texas is unique about the Texas approach that has made it successful? We'll share microphones, Tom.
Test. So, approach to innovation. I think we're uniquely benefited from our state's leadership. I was thinking about early adopters, and what's unique in our state is we started in 2017 with passage of our first autonomous vehicle law, and it was spearheaded by a senator from Dallas, but also a senator, our Senate Transportation Chair, who's from East Texas. So you couldn't have a greater difference in background and needs and thoughts about their constituents. But they were and continue to be very forward-thinking and very open to innovation. They just met with representatives from across the industry about 2 months ago and talked about potential legislation coming into this coming session in January. But they emphasized they want autonomous vehicle businesses to be successful in the state. They want EV businesses to be successful in the state, and they want connected technologies as well. They want all of that to work, and they just want it to be performing to the levels that the public expects. And that's a high bar, right? If we're across the industry emphasizing the value of AV safety and how it will deliver much greater safety than human drivers over time, then that bar is set high, and it's not necessarily defined. And I don't think that they're going to get to the point where some others may have to set specific standards on that, but there's more of a feeling of this is what you should perform like, and you should perform as well as a human, if not better. I found it fascinating you brought up the rules, because I just read a tweet this morning on that, and I think that's great. That's just another example of, can we get to a common baseline? What's the minimum acceptable standard, and is it common so that the public can understand what those capabilities are? So getting to similar naming conventions, getting to at least a common performance level, and then there's still a lot of opportunity for the OEMs and other developers to build better and to be competitive, but at least we all know what the baseline is that we're getting, and I think you see that coming from both directions, both from the ADAS side as well as from the AV side, and we see that across the different platforms, because we kind of look at it in Texas as trucking, box trucks, robot delivery systems, and then passenger vehicles, which is what everybody tends to think about. But we have all of them in the state, and we've been pretty open to working with them, focused on their platforms, specific issues they may have, and having that collegial engagement, I think, has really been what's been successful for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really interesting thinking about this. Aicha, you mentioned the different locations where you have wheels on the road, right? In terms of approaching another, because it's not only what's the regulation that allows me to be on the road, but it's also these vehicles need to be stored, cleaned, obviously charged. We've talked a lot about that today. How do first responders interact with them if it's their first experience, right? So I'd be curious from both of your perspectives on, how holistically should a company kind of interface with a municipality to get off the ground?
Very holistically. I mean, first of all, not to embarrass you, but thank you. The state of Texas is really setting sort of a blueprint on how to do this. And we have to be accepted in the community. We have to train first responders and also understand what are their concerns. I can tell you that, for example, at Zoox, we've made a couple of modifications where I'm going to disclose something we haven't disclosed publicly, but they were like, oh, we need a sticker with both a QR code and a phone number. And, I'm like, well, why do you need both? And people explained to me, because first responders, some only like the QR codes, some only like the phone number. And so that's what they need, that's what you put out there. And you also need to tell them some of the things about how the vehicle will react in certain situations. We had our first pullover in the state of Nevada. It was quite cute in some ways. And watching the interaction, it went exactly as described. And so it's again, if you're transparent, you show your performance, you show your results, and you also listen with big ears as to what the community needs, what the authorities needs, and then you work towards that roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, there have been several really successful engagements from across the industry. Sadly, some of them are no longer with us. Drive AI might be an example of that. But I think what's been great is all the companies share their knowledge together, generally speaking. We have a lot of great partners. We have a state AV task force where we all meet and discuss what are their challenges. And again, that's across the different platforms of different types of challenges. And they've learned from each other about what's worked and what hasn't worked. And so that engagement with law enforcement, the engagement with the public, how do you go out into the communities? I think we've served a good role as a facilitator of that. We kind of have a running list of all the leadership of a metropolitan planning organization, of a city, of the government entities, in addition to that from the state level in a given region. And that's one of the first things we do is when a company comes in, we say, okay, here's your list. Here's who you have to engage. We're not going to do the engagement for you. We can actually introduce you if you want. But get out there, meet with them, ask them about their communities, and go beyond the elected leadership to engage specifically in a community, especially if you're talking passenger vehicle and robot delivery, local in and around type operations. And it's been very successful, and they've held town halls, and they've met with representatives from disabled communities and brought them in and actually walked them through what would be their specific needs. And those are some of the best lessons learned, as well as the interaction with the local law enforcement. And we do have a lot of companies that host training sessions, especially in a region where they're about to deploy, and continue to do those because you can never get them all at once, and there's always changeover. And that's one of the big questions I ask is, how are you going to sustain this over time as you recognize that people change jobs, you lose police, you lose fire, and it's just going to be a constant education process until you get some point decades down the road where it's just a known activity.
So shifting tunes a little bit, vehicle life cycle. So you mentioned 2029, not too far away, right? In this context. So the development cycle is long. We're talking 5 to 7 years. As technology changes and infotainment, convenience, safety become so intertwined, Jim, how do you weigh investment decisions on emerging technologies, knowing you've got time to investment, seeing it proved out, and then there's the time to get it into a vehicle?
So there's two things going on here. There's the pace of innovation, and then there's the pace of production and delivery. And what's happening in automotive, which I mentioned earlier, is that the market is clocking much faster than it used to. There's a great line from Ted Sarandos, who's now, I think, the co-CEO of Netflix. He said, Netflix has to become HBO before HBO becomes Netflix. And high tech is becoming automotive, so automotive better become high tech, or else automotive is cooked. And so the challenge that the automotive has is, first of all, they don't really have a bird's eye view or a on-the-ground view of the pace of innovation. And that's why Toyota Ventures exists. So we have a sensory responsibility to let them know what's going on, right? We're an $800 million early stage venture capital fund that's structured very much like an institutional financial venture capital fund with all the trappings, financial incentives, in order to align with startups. But that's only one part of our job. The other part is to bring these startup cultures close enough to a venerable OEM like Toyota so there's some cultural contamination into Toyota. And to put a little bit more detail on that, I think about it like, and I'm obligated by employment contract to use automotive metaphors, first gear and fifth gear culture. So an OEM the size of Toyota is operating in fifth gear, very high momentum, high sales, high profits, very low maneuverability, right? We can't afford to do anything irresponsible. We can't have failed attempts. We can't have, in statistical parlance, type 1 errors. If we have type 1 errors, we either lose tens of billions of dollars or people get hurt. So we can't afford that. What we can afford, at least in the near term, is missed opportunities, or what's called type 2 errors, right? And big companies, and especially big automotive companies, miss opportunities all the time. No one gets fired for missing an opportunity. Intel finally is getting punished for missing many, many opportunities. Aicha knows, she used to be at Intel. But it takes a very long time for those missed opportunities to be levied on those who perpetrated those mistakes. Startups are the exact opposite. They're running in first gear, right? They have very low, but they have no profits. They have maybe some sales. They get punished for missing opportunities. They get punished for type 2 errors. They don't get punished for type 1 errors because their errors don't cost that much. And so and when Austin started and Aicha started their companies, type 1 errors were relatively inexpensive. As you get into second gear, third gear, fourth gear, they get more expensive. And so the trick for automotive OEMs is to recognize that there's big cultural differences between innovation that's in first gear, and even if you're doing stuff internally, to construct them a lot like a Lockheed Skunk Works. Separate, different incentives, maybe even physically separated. Let them run. I mean, Toyota Ventures is very independent from the rest of Toyota. And it's by design, and we were fierce about our independence just for those reasons. Then, once we bring companies closer to the mothership, and we did that in the case of Joby, the electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, very publicly now, the mothership responds. And you start to see amazing adoption of quite innovative technologies. And then the symbiosis happens, which is wonderful to watch, of the strengths of the corporation being wed to the innovation of the partner startup company. And we are still running these experiments, but so far so good.
Great. Yeah, so maybe flip that question to you, Austin, on the supply side of this. When you're planning for a new product or a new function on a product that takes months, years to develop, and then you have to enter that automotive cycle of winning that business, how do you weigh investment decisions, internal R&D with that time scale?
No, and it's a great question, and I think that was actually a really good analogy, between the different modes of the startup of, first gear, second gear, third gear, of how ultimately you have to have a transmission that matches to that fifth gear, with the automaker as well.
Things grind.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's always that friction, but I think, but that's where the sparks are created, so to say. I think, so when it comes down to it, clearly, yeah, these are, as you said before, very long design cycles, for automakers. It's something that people don't often appreciate, when coming from the traditional technology world, consumer world, and everything there, where, platform lifespans, can go as long as a decade, when it comes to this, and sometimes even electrical architectures spanning, significantly longer in vehicles. And that's why it's so important to be able to get it right. Of course, these innovation cycles are increasing, but it's still one of those very high barrier to entry, but also high barrier to exit type industries. And I think for us, in this case, as we build out, LiDAR, technology, AI, semiconductors, and have these now, deployed. The thing is you kind of have to always, as you're matching, for example, just as we've done with Volvo for the first major launch, which we're excited to now have cars out on the road, with consumers with the LiDAR technology, out there today and ramping up to get into the hands of people globally. At the same time, you have to have the next generation innovations that are there, lined back up that are also in that first gear, and then taking through the ratios, then slot into the next generation vehicles beyond, and that's where you see, like in our case, huge step function improvements in performance, huge improvements in cost, huge improvements that ultimately result in radical improvements to top line and bottom line. And I think it's all those things that make the difference. But you have to be doing things in parallel, at a certain stage. That's kind of where we're at. And that's also the distinction of, as mentioned, a lot of companies in this industry, just simply don't survive for that same reason. I think it was, same thing for us. I think we counted, it was like 5 years ago, we had 200 competitors in terms of different. Actually, I'm sure Jim remembers probably the names of every LiDAR initiative that was done by every tier one automaker.
Teams and teams and teams and teams.
Exactly. Only a few. Yeah, exactly. So now you can count on one hand, how many are able to successfully develop product there, much less industrialize and deploy it in global series production. So to be able to do that, and that's something that we've been kind of uniquely able to do for the first time. So that's really where I think we see a lot of the industry going, and you just got to keep the innovation cycle forward to make it happen. But
yeah, so Jim, you alluded to this a couple times now. I love all of your take on, we have this huge emphasis now, especially the last couple of years, on the software-defined vehicle. And we've got OEMs making massive projections. 2030, we're going to save X amount, or we're going to make X amount as a result of this investment in software-defined vehicles. But one of the biggest driving forces behind this is shrinking that development cycle time, right? We've seen traditional global OEMs potentially looking down to 3 years from a typical 5 to 7. In China, with domestic OEMs, much more dramatic, right? We see 12 months, 18 months turnaround time, which is unheard of in this industry. So in a world of shorter product cycles, how does that impact your investment decisions, or increased burden on product delivery or validation that needs to happen before these products can go out? Anybody want to chime in on that?
I mean, I think one has to back up the boat and think about it a little bit holistically. Sometimes I speak to people and they talk about the software aspects coming into this world. I was lucky enough to work in semiconductors first, where first of all, you kind of dig a hole in the ground and bury billions of dollars, and a few years later you come back and you hope to get hundreds of billions of dollars, and you quickly realize that there's an ecosystem around all that. You have to think about the product and the modularity of it. Like, for example, in our robotaxi, not everything is a few months cycle, but not everything is also a 5-year cycle, right? Decisions we make around, I don't know, battery technology versus can we switch a sensor out or not? Where we use heuristics versus where we use machine learning, how do we connect? So you really have to think about the modularity of the set of technologies you're integrating together, and then integrate different life cycles together. You have to think about the cost of validation. I mean, when somebody comes in and tells me, oh, there's this beautiful new sensor from Luminar, and I'm like, yeah, that's great. How much does my stack have to change? How much data do I need to collect? How much of it is throwaway of old stuff? What validation infrastructure do I need to put in place? And if check, then the discussion starts. And you have to do it with several different things, because we're bringing so many technologies together. I think one of the things too important, I don't know about traditional automotive because I haven't worked in that space, but I think a lot about our robot as a computer on wheels that delivers a service as a customer channel, and you have several different industries that are coming into play, and you pick the right methodologies and the right cycles and worry about how you integrate them together. And that's the only way you can minimize investment. Because otherwise you could think we're bringing what? Uber and, I don't know, Uber, Lyft, Didi, plus some type of robotics, plus autonomy together. No, look at the intersection, not the union.
You want to comment on that?
Anyone else want to jump in
No,
on
I'm
it?
just fascinated on it that you just talked about systems engineering is what I
Pretty
call
much.
that. And I'm fascinated by how much you've begun to parallel, high-end aircraft development, military development, which, incorporate a great deal both on the physical components but also the software components, and all of that has to come together, and it has to meet a very high, rigorous demand. And I think it's just great that you guys are implementing that.
You said that I spent my first job out of school was launching rockets for what's now Lockheed Martin. I did some work in Fort Worth on the F-16 in your neighborhood. And I worked on the avionics stack. And it really was, to Aicha, your point, is we built basically a technical firewall between our avionics suite and the rest of the aircraft. So long as it was 1553 bus, and it would talk to the engine gimbals that were 300 feet down from our stack, that was our interface. And we could change, because at the time, laser gyros were changing very fast. Now they're the size of a chip. They used to be like this giant. But they were changing every year. And we wanted to keep up. And we knew we had to build a firewall if we were going to be able to keep up, because we knew that was going to change faster than the actuators on the gimbal at the bottom of the booster. And I think the same thing has to happen in automotive, where now we got ECU scattered all over the place, legacy, and that is now being consolidated in some way into a system computer that deals with perception, prediction, planning, and then gets actuated out. And I think traditional OEMs are grappling with that. I think the newer players do have the advantage. They don't have the tyranny of the installed base, right? We have the tyranny of the installed base. So we have 100 million Toyotas out there. We're not going to recall them and put in a computer in each one that's centralized, right? We're going to migrate the fleet. And so we have to think much more carefully about how to do that. But we have to do it.
One last element in terms of investment. We talk a lot about dollars, but I think the investment in people is also important. Because I can tell you that, at least in our case, we have to have a blend of people. You mentioned aviation, so we hire a lot of aviation people, a lot of aerospace engineers, because they bring that rigor around system engineering, around redundancy, around sort of what are all the ways. It's not just safety of the stack, but it's also safety of the hardware, and so functional safety. But there is nothing more fun, I think, don't tell them I said that, than to have a meeting with sort of the edge of AI, who almost wants an LLM to drive the car, and the edge of aerospace. And the job is to actually make them see again the common goal, and what do we borrow from each, and where do we make compromises on both mindsets in service of the product. And then keeping them motivated along the way so that they come back the next day to want to do it again together, because it does take that different mindset. And I think that for us, that means sometimes we have to pull back the little Silicon Valley fast, and say, hey, slow down, let's talk about this. And maybe for traditional companies, it's the other way around. The software people need to be at the table and need to own some of the decisions.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. One thing we were talking about when we were, I'm sorry, did you want to?
I was just going to add one thought, because did deal with this in the military too. It is, as you introduce the software component, it just changes the mechanical side of the entirety of it. And going back to the safety question I think you asked earlier, I always think about how are we going to be able to validate that as we do software drops and changes on the fly, especially you're doing over the air. How is NHTSA, how are people in general going to be able to confirm or be assured that the system as a whole functions correctly? And that's one of the biggest questions we really haven't solved for. We see that as a federal role. I don't know where Kristen is, but we've long argued this as it related specifically to AV, because the companies came in with their position was, we're doing performance. We're delivering capabilities of the operation of the system. So much of this is regulated at the federal level, and you maintain your traditional state roles of registering and licensing. And we've waited. I think our legislature has been very patient in when are we going to see those rules be common for the entire industry so that everybody knows what to do. And other states have felt that that they haven't moved fast enough, so they've incorporated more laws, which is causing, I believe, more confusion for all of y'all to deliver. So it's a partner, going back to the partnership question, it's a partnership at all levels of government as well as with the entire industry to get to an agreement on what we need to do.
Yeah, so one of the interesting conversations I hadn't really thought about when we were talking ahead of this panel is the impact we're making on cars on the road today, right? So when we talk about autonomous vehicles, there are investments in infrastructure, for instance, that have benefits to people today that are driving vehicles. So, Darran, I'd love for you to chime in on how some of those initiatives in Texas are supporting even maybe L2 or L3 vehicles on the road.
So it's one of the mantras I have is whenever I argue for an infrastructure improvement or engagement with the AV industry, that what we're doing to better enable their operations has immediate benefit to human drivers, and especially ADAS-equipped vehicles. So if I argue for a more aggressive paint striping campaign to make all of our striping across the state more clear and updated and refreshed, well, that helps lane keeping assist systems, and I know they're all somewhat different, and some depend upon more, of that than others. But in general, that's an arguable point. And gee, wouldn't it be great if my grandma could see the lanes in the road? But I think everybody would agree that would be great, especially in rainy conditions and things like that. So just minimal things like that, and then take it up from the basic mechanics of civil engineering, and you take it into the technology side. But we've continued to push the envelope on what it means to be connected. We've stressed, especially when we went through the DSRC issues with the spectrum and such, that it's about getting information, which is enabled through data, out to the consumers, to the users of the system, and not trying, in our case, to be specific about how that happens, but to take advantage of how they're receiving that information now. So if it's onboard mapping systems, if it's mapping systems in their cell phones, if it's the DMS signs on the side of the road, can't we find ways to push the traffic important information now that will improve their safety? And that's pretty much what we've done. We've focused on getting that out to all the major mapping companies, especially into the OEM vehicles as well, to the trucking fleets. And at the same time, we're working on building out, digital infrastructure to provide a backbone of that across the entirety of the state.
I wanted to pivot too into supply chain, because this is one topic that touches on every word behind us on the agenda here. So maybe, Jim, if we want to kick it off from the investment angle, one thing that we kind of asked ourselves is there enough meaningful scale in supply to support autonomous vehicle fleets, and what kind of needs to happen for that to be the case?
So when you're thinking about anything that's very innovative, there's this tendency to figure out how much you're going to vertically integrate. Because if you vertically integrate, usually your costs are higher, but you have more control over your dependencies. So you have less dependency on the supply chain if you're going to innovate very quickly. And you see a lot of companies doing that. Joby, which Aicha and I both have some exposure to, they have vertically integrated intensely in order to control their dependencies and therefore the dependence on the supply chain, and they have been able to move the fastest in the industry because of that. A big OEM like Toyota, and again, I don't speak for Toyota, I just speak for Toyota Ventures, but just from my observations, there is tremendous reliance on horizontal diversification for cost. right? Because you lose your control, but you've lowered your cost, because now you can push every supplier to deliver at a price point that will deliver very high profit margins to the OEM. The challenge is you can't have both at the same time. And that is a bit of a whiplash for some of the more venerable OEMs, that they want to go fast, but they also want to go fast and cheap. And there's old engineering adage that pick good, cheap, or fast, but you can only pick two of good, cheap, or fast. So it has to be good, right? Safety, functionality, all the. So you only can have cheap or fast. You can't have both cheap and fast. And so this is the challenge for innovation and supply chain, that if you're going to want to go fast, it's going to be more expensive for a while. And high tech has demonstrated this. The top of the line units are always more expensive, and then as they get democratized, as the volume grows, the price drops. And I think that if we're going to want to see this innovation move into the market quickly, we're going to see them at higher price points. I mean, Tesla kind of did prove that. They are really struggling to lower their price points because of this issue. Eventually, they're going to have to break through, which means they're going to have to, and they are, diversifying more and more to lower their cost basis.
Austin, we talk about LiDAR. This is particularly interesting around supply chain challenges because it's a critical technology. And when we think today, China produces the most LiDAR around the world, right? We've got obviously geopolitical tension between the US and China. If there are tariffs or bans or anything of the sort, that's a high degree of risk for critical technology. So what would be your perspective or advice for an OEM or an integrator on how they need to consider that with their risk mitigation and supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we definitely need to look at this from the perspective of America more generally too, and recognize the notion that China has taken a step forward ahead, particularly with some of the local domestic automakers there. They only represent around 10% of the global volume of vehicles shipped annually. But nevertheless, and particularly some of the startup OEMs there, have done a really interesting job of already starting to advance new technologies at even more rapid paces than what some of the traditional automakers are used to. So this is really where, from a supply chain standpoint, I think it's very clear that there's becoming a very divided world, in that respect. And, we already start to see this, like, the blacklists that have happened with, the other competitive, LiDAR company when it comes to the U.S., and other kinds of critical technologies that are happening and coming into play, which is just really interesting to see and observe, both from the outside, but then also being in the industry on the inside, of course, just how the dynamics play out. And I think there's also the battleground within China, which is then half of the volume within China is actually global automakers delivering vehicles into China, which is another thing of where is a battleground on its own. But I think it's very important, in the case for my company, for Luminar, the core technologies that we develop, are centric to the U.S., between all the way from the semiconductors that we make, which is multiple different kinds of semiconductors that go into the system, from the laser chip, the receiver chip, the processing electronics, like everything that goes into that all the way up to the stack, is relevant there. And then we have our factories there too. We have it split out between Monterrey, Mexico, which we're in series production in currently, that's delivering to automakers around the world, and to Volvo already in series production. But we also, for those same concerns, have also launched basically a factory and set up in China, in Xiamen, specifically for that same reason of kind of a separate supply chain ecosystem. And that's really important to have that global diversification, in a world that's becoming increasingly divided. You have to hedge against that risk. And I think ultimately the end state is that the Western world is going to catch up, and the volume opportunity is obviously dramatically higher. Overall, it's just, I would say, probably like 3 years offset behind China right now in terms of some of the initial deployments. But as Jim mentioned, there's always trade-offs for the speed of where, when it comes to quality of product and everything, and that's really the distinction of where I think automakers like, the Nissans and Mercedes and Toyotas, of the world that are advancing rapidly are going to take a more, quality-focused approach, at the product to be able to deliver huge value to the table and push that forward. So that's, I think, what's going to happen for the rest of the world supply chain, at least for the section of industry that I see in, and I think those ripple effects happen for lots of other spaces within the technology world that's applicable more broadly.
I'd be curious to hear your perspective on the integration conversation that Jim mentioned in terms of how much do we insource or outsource. We've seen a number of OEMs that have taken on a lot of software, and then a number of OEMs that have backed away from taking on so much software. We also see on the supplier side, component manufacturers become software solution providers around that component or sensor. So,
Yep.
What's your perspective on how you manage that balance?
No, it's a great question. It's really funny. It's things go in cycles, and I haven't been around long enough to see all of the total cycles about how much people insource, versus then outsource to other relevant suppliers and tier ones, and go through the cycle of no, we need to give more people externally more responsibility versus no, we need to take this in-house. And I think the harsh reality is that no matter which way you put it, automakers are very, very good at a lot of things, and like some of the best in the world. But when it comes to building complex laser systems, when it comes to building complex new semiconductors, when it comes to building AI systems, they're just not the best in the world at it, nor is they set up the infrastructure for the same reasons that Jim mentioned earlier, and for the same reasons that, I'm sure like Zoox is a separate company than, probably, or entity, right, and brand than probably the rest of Amazon or something, would you say, right? In comparison for those, you have to have that innovation. Maybe not. I don't know, but
you know the answer, so don't act like you don't know. Yes, it is for that reason. But I hope to earn the opportunity to be so big and important.
Yeah, exactly. And then then you would be acquiring Amazon then,
Whoa, easy. Okay, talk about LiDARs and supply chain.
Exactly,
yes.
Exactly. Oh man, no, but I think that's right, and that's exactly what's happening is that as we push forward, these are the big questions that we have to make sure are answered, and open it up. I know there's only a short time, but happy to open it up to anyone else if there's other commentary.
Yep. One prediction we got right here beforehand is we're going to need another few hours to get through all the topics we're hoping to touch on today. So hopefully this is good, skim the surface, and we can kind of pull each other aside afterwards to keep it going. Thank you for being on the panel today. Really insightful conversation, and thank you for being a good, attentive audience here today. At this point, we're out of time. I'd like to turn it over to Itay Michaeli, Managing Director at TD Securities, to talk about our next session. Thanks, everyone.